But he was able to put together this coalition by just telling the truth to people and telling them truths that they didn't want to hear. And he went against all the kind of political wisdom of, you have to tell people what they want to hear. And he would go to colleges like Creighton University in Nebraska and the students asked him, are you going to keep our draft deferments? That was the reason most kids were in college, because they didn't want to go to Vietnam. And he said, no, I'm not going to, because it's unfair that 50% of every paratrooper unit in Vietnam is black, because they don't have access to the college. He said, I can get my 11 kids into college and get them out of the draft. But that means that the war is going to be fought by black people alone, and that's not, a good result. And so he got booed at first, but then at the end he'd get a standing ovation. And he did that all over the country, telling people news that they didn't want to hear. And as it turns out, it worked. The last day of his life, he won the most rural state in the country, South Dakota, and the most urban state. And when I was, when we rode on that train and brought his body from, I was with him when he died, and then we brought his body from Penn Central in New York to Union Station in Washington. It was it should have been a 2.5-hour train ride. It was a 7-hour train ride, because the tracks were lined with people, and the people with a whole cross-section of Americans. They were whites and blacks and people in military uniforms, hippies. And he had, and rabbis and priests and nuns. I remember going through Delaware and seeing 7 nuns standing in the back of a pickup truck outside of Wilmington, waving their rosary beads at us. And it was this entire cross-section of the American experience that he had been able to unite, really by telling people the truth, and instead of appealing to their anger and their greed and their xenophobia and bigotry, he had tried to remind them of the hero that's inside of all of us, and that we're part of a community, and that we've got to resist the seduction of the notion that the only way to advance ourselves as a people is by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind, that we have to go together. And people were willing to put aside, to transcend their narrow self-interest and see themselves as part of a larger community and a noble adventure. And I think we have to get back to that vision, bringing Americans together, the Trump people, and as you said, when you start talking to people, you find all these things we have in common. And part of the censorship regime is to keep us from talking to each other.
Yeah.